We are going to talk with go with another very core topic of Python, object-oriented programming. These are all the principles or features of OOP, and we just had a formal introduction in the last class. So probably we know that. So any OOP has these features like object, class, encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance, and polymorphism. So any language with these features is called as OOP. So there are so many object-oriented programming languages, but everywhere the concept of OOP is same. Maybe language changes here and there, the syntax changes, but object and class approach is same. And we had discussed what is an object. It is a real world entity, something like person, place, or a thing. And we also call it as instance of a class. So what instance does is it allocates memory for a class. And we just discussed that we see all this in detail, in depth with examples at memory level. We see all this, we discuss all this with examples so that you get much more bigger picture. Generally, when we talk about object has properties and actions. And if you ask me what is properties means suppose you take the example of person as object. So properties of person like name, age, color, height, all these are properties. And generally properties are represented with variables in a program. Actions are nothing but something like reading, writing, right? And sleeping. There are many things like that. So, and actions are represented with functions or methods in a program. So function and method is a synonym. We can use both interchangeably. We don't have any problem there. So this is what we had discussed in the last class. And next thing is how do we create object? So this is the syntax. So this is sorry friends. So this is the syntax. And syntax means these are rules and we must follow that. So some reference equal some variable name equal to class name. We should create object with class name followed by parentheses. And something at the right side, this is important. So okay, that we assign to some variable. And that variable technically we call as reference variable. And this is syntax, just remember. Okay, so now if object has properties and actions, where do we declare properties and actions? So for that, we use class. So we use class to declare properties and actions in the form of variables and methods. Properties we declare with variables, actions we declare with methods. That's how we do, friends. So now, what is a class? A class describes about properties and actions of an object. We discussed all this in the last class. That's why I'm quickly walking through this. That's all. Okay. So this is just a quick recap. That's all, friends. And anyhow, we do discuss with examples so that you get much more deeper idea about class and object. Okay. What exactly is a class? It describes about properties and actions of object. So simply, in a very simple discussion, class is collection of variables and methods. Inside class, we declare variables and methods of object. And in simple terminology, in simple statement, a class is plan or blueprint of an object. Okay. And we declare class using keyword class. So to declare class, first thing we need a keyword class. And this is syntax of class. Class is a keyword. It should be in lowercase. Class name. And then you put functions and then variables inside that. And if some of you are from Java or C Sharp, there will be a slight change in the way we declare classes in Python compared to Java and C Sharp or any traditional C++. traditional programming languages. Okay. The way we declare instance variables is slightly different here because I worked in Java as well. So, and I do have experience, a bit of experience with .NET. Okay. So that's why, and right now I am even working with Python. So just to give you that quick difference, I'm just bringing to your notice. What is it? There is a slight difference between class, how the way we declare instance variables in Java and C Sharp or C++ and in Python. Slightly there is a change. It's not there. We don't have too much of variation, but or deviation, but there is a slight difference between the way we declare classes and instance variables and methods in Python compared to other famous traditional languages like Java, C Sharp, C++. But anyhow, this is the syntax. This syntax is same anywhere, class name. But we declare functions directly, this instance methods, instance variables. If we have static variables, static methods as well, we'll go one by one. And this is a simple example, class book. We declare instance methods of class and then instance variables inside that. And if you ask me what is this instance variables, what is this instance methods, all that, we will discuss that in detail. Nowhere, we don't have any, we are not going to leave with any confusion. We are going to cover everything in detail, right? We make sure what is instance methods, what is instance variables, static methods, everything. So this is the idea about class. This is syntax. You must follow this. It is a syntax. It is a rule we must follow. And the standard we follow in development. Always a class name must start with uppercase. And every inner word starting letter should be uppercase. For example, person you can see here. P should start with uppercase. Employee details. See, you can see every word starting letter is uppercase here. So E is uppercase, D is uppercase. This is the standard you should follow while working with classes. Okay. Even for methods, we use camel case. Starting should be lower, and after that, every inner word starting letter is upper. That is for methods we follow, even for variables. Okay. So this is the idea here, friends. Generally, so you got it right, friends. What is class? All that. This is just discussed in the last class. So this is syntax of class, some class name, and then functions and then variables. If you want, you can directly declare static variables and methods. We'll talk about that. And the standard, this is important. You have to follow this while doing development. Okay. And of course, generally, even if you ask anyone, what is a class? Class is even a data type again. Like any other primitive data types, class is also a data type, but it is user-defined data type. If it is built in or primitive, we have int, float, complex, booleans, all this stuff, all this, right? So they are all what? They are primitive data types, and classes are user-defined data types. Means you can define your own data types with classes. Okay. So that is the idea. And generally these user-defined data types like classes, we call them as reference types. The other synonym for class types is reference types. We'll see all that with examples, but I'm just giving you an FYI. Okay. So this is the idea, friends. This is the idea about what is class and how to declare that and what is the object. So all that. Now, before we start jump into programming, so let me open PyCharm meanwhile. I think it is closed here. Before we jump into programming, the first thing we should understand is steps to implement classes and objects. What is the approach we should follow to implement classes and objects? Okay, step one. Always we should declare class first. So this programming, excuse me, friends, declaring classes and objects starts with declaring class, because without class you cannot expect object. Objects don't exist. We create objects for classes. So first thing, this is the syntax. First define a class. So with whatever variables you want and methods you want, instance variables, instance methods, static variables and static methods, are class variables, class methods, all that. So this is the simple syntax: class, class name. Non-instance members. Non-instance members, instance in Python, we have static and class variables. Okay, and then functions. Inside function, you define instance variables. You don't need to think much about all this, because we are going to see everything in with examples so that you get a clear idea. So this is step one. First, you define class with whatever variables and methods you want inside that. Generally, inside a class, we declare instance members and non-instance members. Most of the time, we use instance and instance methods, instance variables. And in some cases, we define static variables, static methods, static class variables, or class methods. We'll talk about all that. Okay, just an FYI. What type of variables can be there inside class? Or what type of members can be there inside class? A class can have instance functions, instance methods, and instance variables. Static variables, static methods, and class variables, probably class methods. That's it, friends. Okay, this is new thing in Python. In Java or C Sharp, we just have instance and static. We have something as class thing here in Python. We'll talk about that as well. So this is example of simple class. Class, that class name person. Suppose if you are defining something about person, declare that class name as person and then define that instance methods and variables of that person. And sometimes we need static variables and static methods. We may also define them. That's the idea, friends. Okay. Next, after that, once we create class, the next thing always is we should create object. And this is the syntax. Just follow the syntax. That's all. Anyhow, I'm just only giving you steps. When we do example, definitely you'll get a very detailed idea. So this is how you create object, that reference variable equal to class name parenthesis. And this can be, this object can be default or it can be parameterized. Depends. It depends on the kind of constructor you define class inside class. That is a little one more important topic that we'll talk about it once we get a clear picture about class and object topic. Okay, what is constructor, how to add that, all that. Okay, this is step two, creating object. And this is how you create object. Simply that reference equal to or variable equal to that of class name followed by parenthesis. And this is what we call object in Python, not just Python, in any programming. Right. Next, step three. Once we create object, then we try to access members inside class. Suppose you define some variables, instance variables, instance methods, instance variables. Then we access them through object or through object reference. Okay, this is actually the right side part is object, left side is reference. In general convention, we call this as object P. In reality, P is not object. Something at right side is object. And left side is reference. We just hold address of object. You got it right, friends? So that is the idea. And how do we access members of a class, something inside class? We try to access it using this object or object reference. We prefer object reference, in that is the standard way of accessing instance variables and instance method of a class. See, I just made it too clear. So if we want to access instance variables, instance methods, we use object or object reference. Just remember all this. We'll apply all these steps so that you get a clear picture. So generally, how do we access members? So we access members of class either using object or class name. Which members we access through object, what members we access through class name. Instance variables and methods we access them, okay, object using object, okay, outside class, all that you just leave it aside. Using object, for example, this is the syntax, that reference name of object dot member name. For example, assume that inside person there are methods like set data, print data. We call them using reference, something like using this reference of object p dot set data, p dot print data, something like that. And variables we call it as something like p dot name, something like this. You got it right? So this is the idea. So if it is instance members, we access them using object. And this is the syntax for that. That reference of object, okay, and then that member name. If it is a class members, class or static members, we directly access them using class name. What is that? Using class name. This is class, right? Class name, right? We access static or class members using that class name directly. Object is not needed. We don't need object. You can see here something, if there is a variable age inside a class, and if it is a class variable, then we directly call it saying that class name dot that variable name, class name dot method name, something like that. Okay, you got it right. These are the things. Like if it is a method, class name dot method name, just remember, if you see some members are called directly using class name, then remember such members are static or class members. And if you see some members of a class are called using reference or object directly, then such members are instance members. Of course, all this will push you into some confusion. What is this discussion? What is this instance members? What is the static members? What is all this Manoram is saying? Right? You might run into this confusion. It's fine, friends. So we are going to address all these confusions. It's not like the idea is not to push you into confusion, but to make sure we get a broad view of everything in OOP. Because this foundation is very important. Once we get a broad view on this, a very deeper insight on this, then all others are simple. We are just adding some layers on top of class and object. That's all. So that's why we are trying to bring in all that foundational basics that is needed for OOP. Okay, fine. This is fine, friends. So let's get into the discussion now. Let's start doing a simple program. We know the steps, right? Just on a high level, just remember the steps. You know, if you are, I will take an example and study the example and get a very detailed analysis on that. That should give you a clear idea. Now, let's start with example. You take any example. It should not be like car or bus or anything. You can take anything. Okay, we'll do one thing. So we'll start with one example. Let's take something like customer or item. You take example of item. That is our object. Okay. Now we should create, first we should identify, whenever you are writing any OOP, object oriented programming, first we should identify properties and actions. So we'll go step by step. Okay. Already we are familiar with functions, right? Whatever that is needed to write a class, we are already familiar with all those concepts. Right? Only thing is class is just bringing variables and putting into class, bringing methods, functions and putting into class. So just like decorating everything with bits and pieces and creating a class. That's all. You got it right, friends. Means whatever that is needed to write a class, we already had discussed. Those basics are discussed earlier. So now when you talk about item, generally what properties item has? Item name. You take any item, item name. So that is one thing. Item has a name, item price. Okay, and quantity. Generally, it's the quantity. Any item, right? It might be food item, it might be any other utility items, okay, which we use in kitchen. So we just name them with these properties. What is that? Name, price, and quantity. How many items you want, right? Hardware, software, anything. We can name them with items. That is the one. Next. So this is how we should identify properties. Anything you take car or you take course or you take person, just need to identify properties. That is first thing. And now next, second thing, what methods you need to add in inside that are actions. What actions or methods we need inside a class. So to define this, to declare this name, price, and quantity, we need a method or a function. Methods are nothing but functions. We already discussed that. Okay, we should declare a method or a function inside a class. So to declare these variables and to initialize these variables, we need methods. So what methods? You can name anything which is meaningful, something like set data. Okay, which is used to declare and initialize them. And to print that data, to print that variables, we use one method, get data. And you can define that, you can provide any meaningful names to this method. Instead of set data, you can say set item, get item, or input item or print item. Anything should be fine. But when you look at them, names should be meaningful. That's all, friends. So this is the idea. So when you take any object, you take, for instance, car, then car name, car color, car price, car number, something like that. Actions to provide values for those, to declare and set values, we need one method, that is subset car. To print those values, we need get car, something like that. You got it right. First, understand how to create class and how to add methods or functions, how to define variables, and then we'll talk about doing some logic implementation as well. But this is the idea. So you have to break down any object into two parts like this. So variable part and method part or functions part. Now, how do you define this in program? Simple. You have to take class, that class name. So the syntax, step one. Now I am applying step one. What is step one? Create class for this object item. How do you create class? Something like class, that class name item. And inside this, what is that we should do? I'm directly getting into this. We'll try implementing in the PyCharm directly. So do one thing, just create here, right click and then new, just create a Python package. Now we are done with modules as well, packages as well. Now you know what is package. For OOP, I put a separate package OOP. And now inside that OOP, right click and then new Python file. So just name this as item test.py. Okay. If it is Java, we should save the name of program with name of class name, which is having main method inside that. But Python don't have such issues. Okay. It is much more simpler, much more flexible. We don't have such thing. If anyone is from Java, you can ignore that point here. Item test. Okay. Or item details. Give some meaningful name to the Python program. Now, step one, right? We have steps to implement classes and objects. Step one, declaring class. So what is that class? That class name item. You see, I'm following camel case here. This case, standard case. I start my class name with uppercase. Even if you follow or not, these APIs follow that. In development, we strictly need to follow these standards. That is very important. Next after that. So if question is what variables we are defining, we should define. If it is instance variables, we cannot directly define them inside class like this, something like name equal to some item name, right? Some any item. You can take something like, okay, orange. I'm taking fruit as my item, or any food item. Food item in sense something like dosa. Okay, something like name is okay. Price is something like price equal to some 20 point or some 50 rupees. Okay, if it is dollars, it will be much more, some 500 rupees or 1000 rupees, but in India it will be 50 rupees. Okay, and some quantity, how many dosas you want? Quantity means, okay, quantity in sense just like one dosa, two dosas, three dosas, something like this. So if you want to implement some mathematical, if you want to go with some kind of implementing a food menu, you can build a very detailed class for that. You know, right? Food menu means your program should accept any item user is ordering, and you should take number of uh, quantity of that items, and he might order multiple items. So you can create a altogether a very big food menu. That itself is a big project. So for doing something, we can take anything here for implementation. Then food menu is something really a useful application. You can try that afterwards. This is not how, this is general, this is how we define instance members in other languages. But in Python, if you directly define variables like this, these variables become class variables or static variables. This becomes static variables. If I should define instance members, instance variables are methods. Okay, we can directly define methods inside class. Okay, then this is the standard way of creating instance variables or methods. What is that? First, we should define, you know how to define method, right? Just define, say, some set data or set item otherwise. Okay, set item parenthesis. You can see there, so where you should have that self with that method inside a class. And if any method declared with self, this is very important, friends. If you are starting Python and new to Python, if you see any method with self, then this such methods are what? These methods are instance methods. I'll talk about that. Just follow the all these steps, understand these steps. I'll give you very detailed analysis. Maybe today and tomorrow or within next 2, 3 classes, you get a very detailed very detailed understanding. And these methods are instance methods. Any method declared with self inside a class, not outside. Sorry, friends. Such methods are instance methods. If it is other languages, we can directly define instance variables. But in Python, instance variables must be defined inside a instance method. What is that we should do in Python? Instance variables. I'll talk about that. What is instance variable? Soon I will explain that. But just remember till I come to that point. Instance variables must be defined inside instance method in Python. In Python. If it is Java, C# or C++, we declare instance variables and methods separately. We don't have a problem. It's not mandatory to define, or we don't define instance variables in instance methods in other languages. But in Python, if instance variables must exist, if instance variables must be defined, before that instance method must be defined. Defining method is simple. The normal method, just pass self to that, put inside class, that is instance method. Already we know methods, right, friends? We know class functions, right? Same thing, just put that method inside class, put self, then it becomes instance method. Self represents, this is something like this pointer in C++, if you are from C++, or this keyword in Java and C Sharp, or any other advanced OOP languages. Self is that. And these methods, when you say instance method, instance methods are variables belong to object. Okay, what is that? They belong to object, are part of object. I'm giving you very detailed steps or points on everything. So if you ask me a question, for time being, what is instance method? Could you give us a high level idea about it? Instance methods are variables. They belong to object or they are part of object. Again, you ask me a question. What is that part of object? So once we discuss this program, once we do a postmortem, then you get a clear idea. Till then, just understand these steps. So point is simple. To declare that variables and methods for object, what is that? We need instance methods and instance variables. This is how we define that method. Now, now inside this, define these variables. What is that for item? As discussed, we need name and we need price and we need quantity. Okay, these are three variables we are defining now. If you want, you can add how many ever you want. There is no limit for that. It depends on your requirement. So now self dot, when dot name, any variable you declare with self, then it is instance variable. Okay, another important point. What is that? Any method or variable, and another important point. Variable. These are very important things, friends. Declared with what, friends? Declared with self. Or what? Simply speaking, declaration. From declaration point of view, what is instance variable? What is instance method? Simple, right? Any variable, any method or variable with self keyword. Okay, are instance variables or instance methods or variables. So that's all. So just to quickly recognize, if you see a program, what is instance variable methods? What is instance variables? Just looking at self, you can quickly recognize, okay, wherever you see a method with self, they are all instance methods. Wherever you see variables with self, they are all instance variables. Just remember. For now, I am doing a hard coding. Later on, we'll see how to initialize through parameter passing. We'll go step by step. So item name, you can take something like any item, something like some bolts. So, okay, self dot item price. Each bolt might be having a price of some 100, assume that, or something like 10 rupees, and self dot quantity. Okay, quantity equal to some 100. So this is how you should define what is it, friends? Instance method. And inside instance method, you should declare instance variables. And remember, all instance variables must be declared with the self keyword. Then only they are part of object. You might ask me, I'll prove all this. We will prove all this, right? We'll prove with example so that you get idea how they are part of object. Suppose you see, I declare a variable something like item ID. Okay, item ID equal to 101 or someone. You see, in this method, of course, by now you should very clear because I am repeatedly saying that this is class inside class. You know functions already. We defined that method with self. Then this is instance method. Now again we had a very detailed discussion. Any variable declared with self are instance variables. And now in this method, you can see two types of variables. One without self, others with self. Now, what is this variable then? Is it part of object or is it instance variable? What is this here? This is not instance variable. This is a local variable. What variable, friends? So simply speaking, this is a local variable. What do you mean by local variable? Variable which is declared inside a method or a function are nothing but local variables. Okay, and these are specific to that method or function. And these are visible only within that method. Such variables are local variables. Variables, something specific to method are local variables. You can see this item ID, I'm not declaring with self. If I don't declare any variable with self, then it is not instance variable. They are just simple local variables. Got it, friends? So this is difference. So what is this then? By looking at that variables, you can easily see by looking at declaration. If you see anything with self, they are instance variables. And by now you can answer these questions. What are instance methods? What are local variables? What are instance variables? So this should give a clear picture. Now this is how you should define a method, right? And this is how you have to declare instance variables and then local variables, whatever you want. Got it right, friends? So next after that, so we defined all this. Fine. This is just I am adding this local variable just to give you a quick idea. That's all, friends. Okay, next. This helps us. This method set item helps us to define, declare and initialize instance variables. Now, I am declaring one more method, get item. And this method helps me to print all these values, all these variables. Okay, now let's do this now. Print. Okay, I'm just printing them. Later on, we'll go with more advanced approaches. Okay, but for now, time being, as this is a very beginning program, one method to declare and initialize instance variables, one method to print all these instance members. Okay, to print all these instance variables. So now print, what is that M colon? So the name is inside this. Here we should again call saying self dot name. So don't think that as this name is already inside this class, this method, don't directly say name here. That won't work. Even within the same class, if you want to use variable of one method, instance variable of one method in another method, always this self is important, self dot name. When I say self dot, you can see all that variables we declared in this item method, set item method, you can see them here. Name, price, quantity. So make sure, so within a class, if you declare any instance variable, we should access such members always through self. Got it right? This is important, friends. Self dot name. Similarly, now print remaining. Print. What is that we should do? Self dot. Second thing, we should print price. Price. Third thing, self dot. See, here understanding this basic thing is important. Once you get that foundation, this inheritance, polymorphism, abstraction, all that doesn't take much time. So I am spending more time here only, so that once we are good with this foundation, other things doesn't take much time. So this is how you define a class, friends. In this Python programming, this is how we define class. We create a class name and then methods we need for that class, and then instance variables to define that or to describe that object, and any other logic we need to apply. For that we need methods. We keep on adding to implement that logic and whatever we want inside that class. But this is a very simple program with, you can see here, two simple methods. One method to declare and initialize instance variables of class. One method just to display values of that or instance variables of that class. So here, third one, just change this. Here it should be print here quantity and just make a small change to this description. Here, this is price. Okay, this is quantity. That's all, friends. Now, step one is completed. So far, whatever we discussed is step one. Right? Step two. What is step two? Step two is creating object for a class. Even though how big is your class? Maybe you have implemented a class with some 500 lines, 1000 lines, or 2000 lines of code. But still, without creating object, especially when object is must and mandatory, when you have instance methods and variables inside of that. When when object is needed, again a quick question. Not every time you need to create object, but when we should create object. So when we have, answer is simple. When we have, what is it, friends? Instance methods inside class. Instance methods inside class. Okay. Then definitely, of course, instance variables exist inside that instance method. So point is simple. When objects are must. So when you have that instance members inside class, we must create object. Okay. We must create a object. So how do you, then this time you can see in this class, do we have instance members here? Yes, we are very sure of that. So then create object, creating object for a class. Again, you are very clear, right, friends? So if we have just static variables or methods, our class variables are methods. Static or classes, same, friends, variable wise. Method wise, there is a slight change. Okay, in such case, you don't need objects. We can call them directly using class name. But now we started with instance members. If you should call them instance methods outside, first thing you should create object. Then only we can access them. Otherwise, it's not possible. Okay, now creating an object for a step two. Create object for a class. How do you do that? Simply class name. So sorry, that reference, you can take anything, something like item one equal to item. This is, I'm following the syntax. So we created object. This is step two. That reference equal to class name followed by parenthesis. We created object. Now just if it is Java, it's different. Where as soon as you create object, it allocates memory for instance variables, methods, everything. But in Python, if you just create object, this is an empty object as of now. What object, friends? Empty objects. Now on this object, item one dot, you see here. Okay. When I directly say item one dots, let me just show you this. This is important for you. So let me print item one dot. So I try to print name. Let me run this. Let me just show you. Okay. Right click. Okay. Right click. Run this. You can see you got an error. What is it saying? When I try to get name, name is already there inside this class item. Okay. But still I am getting this error. You can see here. So it is saying attribute error, item object has no attribute name. Why this error? Why this error, friends? Because in Python, if you want to call instance variable, before that, what is that you should do? You should call that method in which you have declared this instance variables. If this variable should exist, before that this method should be called. Why? It's a very simple thing, right? If this must be declared and created, then the method inside which we declare them should be called first. That is important. Okay, it is a very simple thing. So then what is that I should do? Don't call variables directly. Before you call variables, what is that you should do? You have to do one more step. What is that? Call that item one dot set item. Once you call set item, then this object is assigned with this all these variables, this name, price, and quantity. Okay, then now you can try. Now you can see there print item one dot same thing. I'm testing now dot name. Now run this. Do the same. Now you can see bolts. But earlier, before calling this method, without calling this method, if you call instance variable directly, you get an attribute error. Why attribute error? Because if these variables must exist inside object, inside this object, okay, then what is that you should do? We must make a call to this set item method. Once we call this method, all these variables are stored into this item object. Then we can call from object directly wherever we want, whenever we want. But one step we should do is we should do a pre-initialization to this object. That initialization to object happens only by calling this set item method. You got it right, friends? So that is another important point. Next, now what you can do, if you want to call all, if you want to print all instance variables in one shot, just simply call, what is it? Get item. Sorry, friends. Now right click, run this. Now you can see here. We are seeing all values from object in one shot. We are able to print that instance variables, all instance variables just in one shot using get item method. Okay, friends, this is a simple OOP program where what is that? We implemented all three steps, creating class and then creating object and then accessing instance methods. And by instance methods, we are declaring instance variables inside them. We are calling instance variables through get item. One method to define, declare, and initialize instance variables. One method to print that values of instance variables. And if you want to call, now this is simple syntax. Once you create object, if you want to call any member from that class, instance member from that class, always you should use this either reference or this object name directly. This object name. I'll show you all that. But this is the idea. And whatever we discuss, this is not enough. Right? This is a simple example of creating class and objects. But there is a lot of discussion here because the terminologies, the technicalities and memory level information, all that is needed. That we need to discuss now. Now I'm copying and pasting this. Please test this. I'm going too slow. I know that because this is a very core topic. Let me just share this simple program with you. Let's play around this, in and around this now. So you got this right? Before now the question is we have to understand these things. So next thing what we are going to do is we are going to do a post-mortem of Python class and object. Let's get into the deep diving of this program now. So now if you see what happens, we'll go step by step. Let's see this. I'll put a debugger and show you at each level what's happening in this program. Got it right, friends? So let me just show you that. This is very interesting. At line 22, it is just an empty object. At line 23, your object is loaded with this instance variables. At line 24, we are trying to get values from the same item object through get item method. Now let's do debugging. Then you get a bird's view of everything about this concept of object and class and instance variables, methods, all that. Let's go step by step. Okay. Now debug this. If it is Java, when we create object, well, that at that time itself, instance variables, methods, everything will be, all that allocation happens. Okay, but Python, right? Now you can see there should be a debug window somewhere. Let me just show you debug window. Not AI assistant. Okay, no problem. Expand this. You can see here, right? You can see at this bottom, this threads and variables, observe this here. By the time we come to this state, this line 20, 20, 22, right? We are just seeing this class loaded, that's all. And nothing is there inside class. Then do one thing, just go one step ahead, okay? Just here, step over. Now, when we say step over, what happened? Item object is created. You can see there. What is that? Item object is created, but still this is empty object. Nothing would be there inside this. Nothing would be there inside this. Okay. You can see that here. Observe this window. Then you can understand what's all happening at memory level. Now, what do you do? We are at line 23. Then say step over. Now, when we say step over, right? You can see here. See here, this one. Item object is created. Expand this. Now all that variables are added to the item object. You can see under that item object, that name, price. Otherwise, I will run debugging one more time to show you that with clear this thing. Now this is the program. Anywhere did you see, can you see that item object? So this is item class, that's all. Class is loaded into memory at this stage. No object, no, we are not seeing any trace of that item object here in special variables. Now, once we move ahead of this line 22, now let's say step over. Now you can see here, this is just fresh. This is created as a fresh statement, fresh object here, or a fresh variable. See, expand this. Nothing is there inside this for now. Object is created. This is empty object. That's all. It's saying protected attributes, but nothing is there inside that. Now go one step ahead. Now we call set item. When we call set item, immediately you can see this object is loaded with this, is assigned with this instance variables here. Name, price, quantity, all this is added to this object. Can you see this here? This is important. See step. So what is that? When just this object is created, empty object is created. Once we call set item, you can see that variables are included or added to this object. Right? Again now, one more step, get item. When you say get item, where these values are coming from? These values are coming, of course, execution is over, so that window is closed, debugging window. So we are not seeing the trace of those variables. But when we say get item, the values, this name, price, and quantity you are seeing in the console, these are coming from this item object. Which object? The item object. You got it right, friends. So points simple. Let's understand the terminologies here. What is instance variable? Why these variables are called instance variables? Instance means what? Object. And with this debugging, you should be very clear. What is that? When we created object, it is an empty one. Then when we call set item, you are seeing all these variables added to that object. Right, friends? Then questions, few questions. You know what is definition of object? Object means instance of a class, right? This is the definition we had discussed in the beginning. Now, next question. Inside object, what is that we have? So you know very well. What is there inside object? When we call this set item method, the set item is adding all these variables to that object. Technically, we call them instance variables. Why instance? Why we call these as instance? Object is nothing but instance of a class, and variables inside instance. Can't we call them as instance variables? Means they belong to object, that's all. Instance variables. This should be very clear for you. Okay. So all these variables you are declaring with self go into the object. And such variables, as we know, object is instance of class and variables inside instance, can't we call them instance variables? Simple. So point one, if whenever you hear the word instance, remember it's the object. Anything that is inside object or that is associated with object are instance members. Now you see another important point. This should be clear, right? What are instance variables? Variables inside object. Simply speaking, so if you want to be more clear, variables created inside object. And if you ask me, how do you prove that? Just now I have shown you. If you want me to again run the debugger, I can show you. Right click, run debug. Again, I am showing you, just if anyone missed that point. Okay, see at this stage, when you start debugging, you can see all that variables and everything that is loaded as a part of this program execution. At this time, just a class is loaded. This is just a class. You can say item class is loaded. Now, when we go ahead with line 22, right, just execute step over. Now you can see object created here at the top, right? So this is class. You can see two things with item, right? At the bottom or at the deep down, this is class name, which is loaded into memory. Second, this is object created with that reference name, item one, you can see here. An empty one, right? So now observe here again, when I execute line 23, that is calling set item, that adds all those instance variables. Here you have all those instance variables inside set item. Those variables are added or they are created inside this object. As of now, we don't see anything there. I expanded it. I expand this. We don't see that. But now after executing line 23, see, now you can see that all that just they dumped, that line dumped all these variables into this object. This is a clear proof. We don't need to again need any proof from anywhere. This is clearly saying that these variables are part of object, created part of object. And in object is nothing but instance. And what is instance variables? Variables created inside object are instance variables. And what are instance methods? Now you should be very clear. Instance methods means methods we call on object. You can see you are saying set item. Set item we are calling on whom? We are calling on object. Item one dot set item means what this set item is doing. This method is creating or it is adding these variables, whatever you declared inside this method, to object. This method helps us to create these instance variables into this object or load them into this object. And this method is a instance method. Why instance method? Because you are calling, simple. You are any method or anything you are calling with reference of object, they are instance members. Either with self, one thing, or either with reference. You see any method calling with reference of object. Okay, they are instance methods. Right? What is instance methods? Instance methods, simply speaking, simple friends. They are methods which are applied on objects. Methods which work on objects. Okay, which work on objects or instance methods. Means generally, how do we call instance methods? Any instance member, either we call with self. One is self means within class. If it is within class, we call with self. Suppose this we are calling inside class or outside class? Outside class. If it is outside, then we call with either reference or with object name. I'll show you that as well. Now, using reference is a standard practice. Of course, you can call members directly with the object name as well. I'll show you that. Just give me some time, that's all. Maybe in tomorrow's session. Now you are calling any member with that reference, object reference. Even such members are instance members. Here it is instance method. Okay. There is a small typo here. Methods which work on objects, and generally we call them with object reference, right? And we call them with what, friends? Object reference. I'm trying to be as we are going too deep into this discussion, okay? Because this is important. This terminology is all that, because people have a lot of confusion with instance variable, static variable. Some people even don't know at memory level what's happening. Okay. So this is instance. Finally, what are instance members? Simply speaking, variable or method or whatever it is. Instance member means any member that is part of object or which belongs to object. Any member which are part of object or which are inside object, which are part of object and which are inside object. So such members are what we call them as instance members. Now, finally, you should be able to have that clear differentiation, right? Distinguishing between this instance variables, instance methods, object, and then what happens when we create objects, how, where variables are, instance variables are created, where they sits. Okay, this is not yet over. Tomorrow I'll give a little bit more deeper analysis, and then that gives you a much more bigger idea. Then you can go and explore any website, any YouTube channel that makes more, that gives you a much more bigger idea, friends. Okay, this is the, we'll stop here for today because we already we are running out of time. But this is the idea. Useful session, right? So this gives you all that information that is needed to understand class, steps to implement class and object, what is class, what are instance methods, instance variables, all that. Okay. So that's all, friends. We'll stop here for this.